The Beatles were close to splitting up when Let It Be was filmed in 1969, but there's a lot the documentary leaves out. From George quitting the group to Paul's growing annoyance with Yoko, the new film fails to tell the full story. About halfway through the documentary, the Beatles start playing through some old rock and roll favorites. During a run-through of You Really Got a Hold on Me, there's suddenly another musician present, jamming with the band on an electric piano. That's Billy Preston. Preston spent a lot of time working with the Rolling Stones after the Beatles, but he isn't even identified in Let It Be. Beatles fans might know who he is, seeing as Preston was credited on the band's 1969 single Get Back. The Beatles knew the musician from its early days playing in Hamburg, Germany. George Harrison brought Preston in during the sessions for what would become the Let It Be album to inject new energy into the band and flesh out its sound as it prepared to perform live. The band was on its last legs, and Preston brought so much energy and newness into the group that they even considered adding him as a permanent member.
You're in the group.
Instead, he just played on Get Back and with the Beatles at its rooftop concert. It should be noted that Preston does figure considerably in the three-part Disney Plus documentary The Beatles Get Back from 2021. His deep impact with the group was one of many aspects of the recording sessions that were left out of Let It Be, but featured prominently in the 2021 doc-series. The Let It Be documentary consists almost entirely of narration-free footage of the Beatles rehearsing songs at Twickenham Film Studios, and then at its own Apple Corps building. The songs that the Beatles rehearsed would later populate the group's 1970 album Let It Be. Later standouts from that record are all over the Let It Be documentary, including The Long and Winding Road and Across the Universe, as well as Abbey Road tracks like Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Because it's depicted in 2021's The Beatles Get Back, there's clearly footage of the Beatles rehearsing other Let It Be and Abbey Road tunes. However, the 1970 film doesn't show those songs being rehearsed. The songs that are left out of Let It Be include early versions of Something, She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, and Carry That Weight.
Something in the way she moves. What attracted me at all?
Just say whatever comes into your head each time. Attracts me like a cauliflower until you get the word.
On January 30th, 1969, the Beatles played a 42-minute concert on the roof of their Apple Corps building in London. The Let It Be documentary doesn't even include the entirety of the concert, which was the Beatles' final public performance. The concert takes up only about 20 minutes of screen time in Let It Be, with the band playing 6 songs: Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, Dig a Pony, and then another crack at Get Back. However, the documentary leaves out a large portion of this important moment in Beatles history by cutting out several songs. The film doesn't include the band's additional take on Get Back, as well as other versions of Don't Let Me Down and I've Got a Feeling. The group's attempts at A Pretty Girl Is Like a Melody, Danny Boy, and a freeform rendition of the UK's national anthem, God Save the Queen, are also left out of the film. The original concept of Let It Be was as a televised concert special, but George Harrison nixed that idea. It was only after Paul McCartney suggested a willingness to do some kind of live performance that the rooftop idea was born. When the climactic moment finally arrives in Let It Be, it's treated by the filmmakers and the Beatles as a mundane routine act. After rehearsing in a practice space together for many days, the band heads up to the roof and plays a series of brand new songs on equipment that's tuned up and ready to go. It all unfolds like a foregone conclusion, when in fact the rooftop performance was only somewhat planned. In a prologue to the film, director Michael Lindsay Hogg mentions that he originally intended Let It Be to be a concert film, not a rehearsal documentary.
It was originally going to be a concert. They were going to perform somewhere.
He also says that he wanted to shoot a day-long show in a large theater. Expectations scaled down over time. When the roof concert was suggested, the Beatles remained non-committal for a very long time. But when John Lennon gave the idea the go-ahead, the band finally decided to perform on the roof. While documentaries are by their nature educational, Let It Be never quite explains the reason for its existence. The remastered 2024 edition opens suddenly with a conversation between Michael Lindsay Hogg and Peter Jackson, who restored the film. In their conversation, the two directors note that the film consists of rehearsal footage for a live show, and then the documentary gets underway. However, we're never told that the rehearsals were supposed to generate a live album from the band. Before filming began, the Beatles planned on performing in a large venue, such as the Sabratha Amphitheater in Libya, but obviously those plans were scrapped. Additionally, the film never mentions the fact that the project was briefly titled Get Back, seeing as the band wanted to use the sessions to return to their stripped-down classic rock and roll sound. The doc also doesn't make it clear that the Beatles are essentially writing the songs at rehearsing. For example, Paul McCartney literally workshops Get Back in front of the cameras. In 1969, George briefly left the Beatles. The various cameras that provide the raw footage for Let It Be most likely captured that moment, but there just wasn't room in the documentary's format of wall-to-wall music to show Harrison's departure. Harrison's decision to quit was born out of the musician questioning his talents as a guitarist and feeling like he wasn't getting much out of the group anymore. So one day, when the group took a lunch break, Harrison announced he was done.
I wanted out myself. I could see a much, better time for myself by, being away from the band.
The group ultimately pleaded for Harrison to return, and after he took some time off with a trip to his hometown of Liverpool, he did rejoin the Beatles. However, it was with some caveats. The reason the action in Let It Be switches abruptly from an eerily lit TV studio to a bright rehearsal space was because Harrison requested it. He felt more comfortable rehearsing at Apple Corps than Twickenham Film Studios. He also wanted to focus on the album and move away from the concert angle, thus explaining the move. Many Beatles fans think that Yoko Ono played a big part in breaking up the band, but that's just a myth. That said, Let It Be doesn't tell the full story of Ono's involvement with the band. By 1969, John Lennon had fallen madly in love with Ono and had asked the experimental artist to marry him. However, Ono's relationship with the other members of the Beatles was very complicated. She was a big presence in Lennon's life during the recording sessions that would become Let It Be, and would usually accompany him to the rehearsals. Even though Ono's face briefly pops up in Let It Be, it doesn't mean she was actively trying to break up the band. After all, Let It Be was made from the same footage as The Beatles Get Back. Since the 2021 series is a lot longer, it demonstrates that Ono was just hanging around a lot. She wasn't contributing to the music or trying to direct the band creatively in any way. What Let It Be fails to show is that Ono was merely knitting, reading the newspaper, and rolling cigarettes while her husband made music. Given the abundance of footage of Paul and John happily jamming with each other throughout the Let It Be documentary, it's hard for viewers to detect much tension. But the film was produced in early 1969, and the Beatles would split up a little over a year later. Suffice it to say, there was a lot of creative and personal disagreements going on in the band, particularly between John and Paul. As shown in Let It Be, the duo kept up a solid and professional working relationship to get the task at hand done. However, they were individually and collectively bristling over life in the band. In The Beatles Get Back, Paul discusses feeling like the band's director, while John appears increasingly distant and aligns himself with Yoko. Some of these concerns were addressed in what John and Paul thought was a private conversation. Michael Lindsay Hogg hid microphones all over the studio facility, including a cafeteria table to record otherwise off-the-record talks. One such moment is shown in The Beatles Get Back. In the scene, John and Paul commiserate over George Harrison quitting, saying the band may not be able to withstand his departure. Paul also hints at the growing resentment over Ono, and correctly predicts that someday fans will blame her for the band's eventual split. He quips,
They broke up because Yoko sat on an M.
Clearly, the 1970 documentary Let It Be was linked to the release of the band's 1970 album of the same name. Both the original doc and album were named after the ballad performed by Paul. However, when the project was being produced, it didn't have a name. About 3 months after the rooftop concert, the Beatles released the first single from the sessions, Get Back, which engineer Glyn Johns proposed as the title for the forthcoming album. However, the Beatles declined to use that name. They also didn't finish the album right away, delaying its release. In mid-1969, the group got to work on a new album, Abbey Road.
They were composing and rehearsing the majority of the Abbey Road songs.
Some of the tracks from Abbey Road were written and rehearsed during the Let It Be sessions. Abbey Road hit stores in the fall of 1969, and only in 1970 did the Beatles finish work on the Let It Be album. This makes Let It Be the last studio album released by the Beatles, even though it was recorded before the release of Abbey Road.